This is Illuminate, the podcast about men with good hearts, open minds, and a desire to make the world better. Welcome to Illuminate. I'm your host, Chris Tidrick, and I'm here with Brian Brauer. Brian has worked in public safety roles since 1990 as an EMT, firefighter, instructor, and nurse. He currently serves as the Executive Director of Emergency Management at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He lives in Urbana with his wife of 28 years, and they have 3 adult children. Welcome to the show, Brian.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, so let's jump right in. The way I like to start all of these episodes is talking to our guests about their motivation. So what do you consider your why? Where do you find purpose and what drives you?
I find that since I was a younger kid, serving others and helping other people be successful has always been a strong motivator for me. That was first revealed through the Boy Scout program. I remember that I was happiest when I was in roles where I could help other people be successful. I didn't realize that was what it was at the time, but making people happy and serving others has always been a core part for me. When I worked in positions at the scout camps over the summer, and my first part-time jobs in high school and full-time jobs were all focused on serving other people.
I think I may have first met you when you were running the mess hall at a Camp Drake when my son was a scout. So yeah. Let's dive into that and talk about your journey. And, feel free to go back as far as you want to go back in your journey. But I'd love to sort of understand the path that you've taken to get where you're at today.
I've talked about something like this with the College of Nursing class. I assist and do a lecture each year talking about how I got to this place in emergency management. And the first slide I put up is a straight line between 2 points. And I say, this is what I thought my life and career was going to be like. And then I put up the equivalent of a ball of yarn with the string poking out either end. And that's kind of how I feel like I got to where I am. I've always had goals of being in a position to help myself grow and advance so that I could be a better servant and a better leader. But I couldn't always anticipate where that was going to take me. And that's been a lot of the fun of the journey I've had in my life. Grew up in New Jersey, just outside of New York City. I was the oldest of 4 kids. I attended a local grade school you could walk to, and then a high school that was a couple miles away. It was a regional high school. Graduated and decided I was going to study nuclear engineering.
Wow.
Not because I had any interest in nuclear engineering, and not because I was necessarily good at any of the prerequisite skills, but my guidance counselor said this would be a great career for you because you're good at math and science. And while I was, It wasn't something that was sustainable for me to be passionate. So I was actually on a scholarship here to the U of I, and that scholarship was withdrawn a couple weeks before class because I didn't meet the medical requirements that were necessary to be able to enlist after completing the education.
Oh, wow.
So I still came out here to school, switched majors. The only thing that was going to be a worse fit for me than nuclear engineering was chemical engineering. So that's where I went.
a series of great choices.
But while I was a freshman, I'd also always wanted to be an EMT. I had several uncles and a couple people that were very instrumental in mentoring and coaching and leading me in my life that were in the fire service. So that was being a volunteer EMT was what I thought was going to be a great path for me to continue to give back. I'd enjoyed the first aid and classes like that in Scouts. So when I was enrolled as a freshman here at the U of I also took a course to get my EMT license. Went through that with a handful of folks, some of which I'm still in touch with, many of which are also still sprinkled around healthcare and emergency services around the Midwest. Thought that I knew what I was going to do from there. I was going to finish my degree, volunteer as an EMT on the side. 2 years into that degree, I realized this is not for me. U of I and I had kind of a mutual parting of the ways, and I started working full-time as an EMT. I then went back and completed a paramedic degree, or paramedic license, and was volunteering on a fire department at the same time. I thought that EMS was the thinking side of the job, and that fire departments were nothing more complex than putting water on fire. And I quickly became enamored by all of the complexities, the team dynamics, and suddenly all that science and math that I enjoyed was fun again, because I had to look at it from the standpoint of, how do you put the fire out? How does a building resist gravity? So I found that to be
a lot of chemistry and physics in that, right?
Yeah. And it was chemistry and physics with a practical application.
Yeah.
It wasn't something theoretical. You know, how many atoms of something can you fit in a gallon jug? It was, okay, this much heat is being produced because the room is this size. How much water do you need to reduce the temperature enough that the fire goes out?
Yeah.
Or what if you can't reduce the temperature, what are your options to remove the fuel or remove the oxygen? So I found that fascinating and challenging. So from 1992 through 23 years after that, I was a volunteer with one of the local fire departments. I ran both medical calls, but also became certified as a firefighter and a fire instructor. Finished a nursing degree in that time also, and I was working at the local trauma center as a trauma nurse specialist. Did that for a couple of years and was also a supervisor in the emergency medical services system. And then after one particular night where it was a really bad night, kind of a faith-shaking night in the emergency room, I realized I enjoy this, but this is not going to be something I can do for the long haul.
Yeah.
And it gives me that much more respect and love for the people that can stay in that career that they thought was going to be their career. So in 2000, for the fourth or fifth time that decade, I made a career pivot, and I took a job at the University of Illinois at the Fire Service Institute. I was the first full-time person hired by a new director who needed to make everything operate within fiscal constraints. That hadn't been a thing before this director, but his success was going to be directly tied to, you can't spend more than you bring in. So I started there in 2000. I was running the basic academy for firefighters, new firefighters that were hired by Champaign and Urbana fire departments, Danville, Pontiac, Charleston, Mattoon. Most of the cities in Illinois that were big enough to be their own city and have their own paid fire department, but small enough that they didn't have their own training facility and their training resources. I worked at the Fire Institute for 20 years. I left in 2022 to become the emergency manager here at the university. I remember one of the physicians I worked with at the hospital, when I left to take the job at the fire academy, he smiled and said, "And how long are you going to do that for?" I passed him at a tailgate last fall at a football game where I was working at the football game as the emergency manager. And I smiled and I said, "Hey, I can give you an answer to that question you asked now." And he said, "What question?" I said, "Well, you asked me 24 years ago, how long was I going to be at that job at the university?" I said, "The answer's at least 24 and a half years." And that's where I'm at now. I'll wrap up my 25th year in August, and it has gone by in the blink of an eye. And a lot of that has to do with it aligning with what my why is.
Yeah. So in a nutshell, can you help our listeners and viewers understand, like, what do you do as the director of emergency management? I think all of your other roles, I think people are relatively familiar with what that entails, but what does the emergency management deal with?
Think of emergency management as that drawer in the kitchen that has a couple of batteries, a broken knife, a headphone adapter, a roll of Scotch tape, the junk drawer. Emergency management is still emerging as a profession, and it's not very well defined. So there's a lot of local flavor to what emergency management does. Fortunately, within higher education, there's a couple core things that emergency management does. One is my team and I are responsible for all of the university's emergency plans for when a bad thing might happen. And it doesn't have to be a bad thing, a building catches fire. It could just be inclement weather, or it could be a large gathering where we want to make sure that we are planning far enough ahead and we're making decisions that are going to help protect all of the students, faculty, staff, and guests that come to an event. The big events that we help provide planning for are football games, our convocation, the Illinois Marathon. While that's not a U of I event, 80% of the races are held on campus property, so there's a huge footprint. Additionally, the 4th of July fireworks and the 4th of July parade, as well as bigger events within the university. I think I mentioned convocation, but also when we have quad day, or sometimes we just have large events that need a little additional support. They want help with creating a plan, or they need weather support. Engineering Open House is a great example of that. That's an event that is completely self-contained by the College of Engineering, but my team and I help with weather support, as well as ensuring that any minors that come to campus are going to be protected and in a safe environment when they're away from their parents and they're here without their guardian. My team also does the plans for business continuity at the university level and at the college levels, as well as all of the plans you see hanging up inside the door of each building. Here's where to go if there's a fire. Here's where the fire extinguishers are located. All of those building emergency plans. The last thing we do is one of the members of my team is responsible for exercising all of those plans. And we can't do every plan all at the same time in the same year. So different plans are cycled in different ways. This year we'll be supporting a full-scale exercise out at the airport. That's one of the FAA requirements. This is year 3, so we'll do a full-scale exercise where we'll pretend like there was an aircraft incident. And we'll need everything from Boy Scouts to volunteer to be people that were on the plane that we can moulage up, to local fire departments that'll help simulate the response, law enforcement to help secure the scene. So it's a pretty involved exercise. Last year, what we did was an exercise where it was sitting around a table talking through what we would do. And year 1 was training to make sure all the players knew what they should expect and what was expected of them.
Yeah, it's as you were describing all of that, I'm like, so if you're doing your job well, you're kind of invisible unless something really bad happens, and then you're there to respond. And it's kind of an interesting place to be as a professional, that if you've done your job well, everything is just normal, right?
Well,
In some ways, yeah.
bad things can still happen, inconvenient things can still happen, but ideally we have a plan in place and everybody that's a part of that plan knows what their job is, and they're practiced and able to add value to the emergency until we can get it under control.
Yeah, it's also interesting as you described the beginning of your career as the trauma nurse and as an EMT, you were in kind of the chaos in those situations, right? That was your job, was to respond to the chaos, and now your job is to plan for the chaos. And I think it's kind of an interesting evolution of that service aspect that you talked about earlier.
Well, it is, but that experience I've had since 1990 of being a first responder and dealing with those emergencies firsthand, whether it's fires or car accidents, acts of violence, medical emergencies, that experience helps me bring a level of reality into those plans so that they're not paper tigers.
Yeah.
The other thing it helps me do is maintain relationships with not only law enforcement, where my program nests under the police department at the university.
Okay.
I jokingly say that I'm the fireman in the police station.
Okay.
But those same people that I was working with on the streets, solving problems and dealing with emergencies early in my career, they're also in leadership roles like I'm in. So there's folks that I've worked with, and we've had a chance to know each other for 15, 20, 25, some even 30 years. And we're still working together to the benefit of creating a safe environment for everyone that lives in our county or comes to visit.
And I would imagine that relationship that you've built with them, it seems to me that in the business that you're in, trust is really important. That if people don't trust each other, the best laid plans can go awry when the rubber hits the road. And so, like, having built those relationships with people and trusting each other probably makes a huge difference, doesn't it?
It does. Trust and operating with integrity. Because I can't undercut you I can't throw you under the bus in a meeting and then expect that you're going to have my back later on. Trust and integrity go hand in hand.
Yeah.
Because if you don't demonstrate integrity, it is much more difficult for someone to want to trust you. That's why two of my top 3 values are trust and integrity.
Yeah, the violation of integrity is the thing that breaks trust most often. You mentioned earlier that growth has always been an important thing for you in leadership, but let's dive into the growth piece of it a little bit. One of the things that I talk about a lot on this podcast is this idea that in many cases, and I think sometimes it's in most cases, to grow, we almost have to deconstruct something that we previously knew. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about, were there any things maybe early in life or earlier in your career that you learned and held very deeply, but as you've evolved over time, that you've had to deconstruct those things and make something that makes more sense to you and is more useful to you now?
I've dealt with that both in opportunities I've had to reflect and go in a different direction. I've also had what psychologist Jack Mesereau calls disorienting events. Mesereau's work identifies that sometimes you have an experience that resets your expectations for yourself, for others. We have those throughout our life. And there's a handful that, when I look at my life so far, that there were those points where I really had to reevaluate, was I doing the right things? Was I where I was supposed to be in my life, in my career? Making a decision to leave the university after 2 years. The whole reason I came out to Illinois from outside of New York was to get a degree and then go off and make a lot of money. Now, 53-year-old me looks back at that 18-year-old and says, happiness means a lot more than money.
Yep.
53-year-old
me agrees with you on that.
But it takes that time and perspective to help you figure out what's important. The things that you may think are important can change over time. When 9/11 happened, I lost a friend when the tower collapsed. He was a firefighter on a squad company in Lower Manhattan. And I remember it was almost a month after 9/11 until his remains were found. And by remains, it was basically enough of his bunker gear that they knew who was in it. So they knew it had to be him. And that was an opportunity for me to recommit to the value of training and the value of ensuring that people are prepared for a little bit more than they're likely to be expected to do. And my friend's sacrifice was a motivator that when I had to reframe or reemphasize what I thought was important in my career, that played a really big role. I also had a more personal disorienting event where I was riding my bike to work. It was dark out. I was going down Florida Avenue, and there's a stretch of Florida Avenue in Urbana that I think is the most dangerous stretch of road to ride a bike on. It's roughly from Lincoln Avenue almost back to Vine Street. And the reason it's so dangerous is once you get past Blair Park going westbound, there are no bike lanes and there is no turn lane. And there's sewer grates, gutters, sticks, debris, everything on the side of the road. And where the gutter meets the asphalt, it's always torn up, always potholes. I always look at them when I go by, seeing if I could see my tax dollars in them, but usually that's not the case. But one of those mornings, somebody was blocking the very narrow shoulder and bike path on that road. It was somebody in a local one-car taxi service. And as I passed them, I had to go pretty much around them, almost into oncoming traffic. And I said, "Hey, thanks for parking like a certain part of the anatomy that we use in the bathroom." That person responded by about 2.5 blocks later, came up alongside me and kind of dinged me with his mirror and knocked me off the bike.
Wow.
It didn't hurt me, And initially I was mad at that person because I was mad at them from them making me have to go into oncoming traffic, which I later deconstructed that that's not what they made me do. That's what I chose to do because my reaction was rather than wait, rather than go to the sidewalk, rather than slow down, I was going to keep moving in the direction I was moving instead of reassessing all of those things. I finished riding my bike to work, was a little banged up, but not, nothing hospital worthy, nothing ambulance worthy. And it made me realize how much anger I carried around with me. It made me realize how I had gotten to a point in my career where I was often in a position where I had authority, I had power, and I often looked at my role as it was my time to be the boss. Instead of the way I look at leadership now, where it's my opportunity to find out how can I serve others? How can I help other people be successful? And that, coming off my bike that morning, was one of the things that started me down that road. I realized how angry I was, and I needed help to unpack that.
Yeah. And how did you go about that?
Well, the first step was realizing I needed to do something with this anger. And the first thing I did was reach out and find a therapist. And we all joke around about, hey, you need professional help. I think there's a problem that we attach a stigma to that.
Yeah.
But
We joke about it too much, but it's so valuable. I've done it myself, and it really is life-changing in a positive way.
And so often in public safety, we don't know that somebody is carrying baggage that's too heavy for them until it's too late.
Yeah.
And I've lost friends to suicide. I've lost scouts that were in my unit to suicide. It's unfortunately a very pervasive problem. And one of the first things I learned was that anger was coming from frustration about things I couldn't control. And it helped me, the therapist helped me reframe that I was putting expectations on things that I had zero control over. And that might range from other people's actions or reactions to something. When we all pitch our greatest idea, we all know it's our greatest idea, but sometimes people tell us that our baby is ugly.
Yeah.
And that's hard to hear if you're coming from a place where you're attaching your ego to your ideas, or you're attaching your ego to your team's success or your success. And there was very little room in my head to withdraw and be in a position to support other people versus expecting other people to follow me. And that was a transformational shift in my mind. I quickly found that as I reframed things and read more about how to change how you're thinking, I realized that not only did I have expectations for other people, I was also ascribing intent to what they were doing. So, for example, when you and I met for coffee, we were on time. But if you were 5 minutes late, back then I would have assigned, Chris changed his mind. He doesn't really want to have this conversation. Yeah. He's not interested. He's not committed to this podcast. Why should I be? And for those of you in the home audience, Chris was there before I was. But that idea of ascribing intent is another road to unhappiness, where we think we know what somebody else's motivations are, and we decide why they're doing something.
Yeah, absolutely. I have preached over and over that the greatest source of frustration in our lives is unrealistic expectations of others. We're causing the frustration because we're not, because we're ascribing something to somebody else that either they have no interest in doing, or they have no capability of doing, or there's some misalignment there. It just creates unhappiness all around because you're unhappy with them. Then because you're unhappy with them, they're unhappy with you. And it's all because of this mismatched expectations.
And it becomes a lovely cycle because now I've ascribed the reason why you reacted the way you did, which may not be the reason why you reacted.
Yeah.
And now that's going to season all of my future interactions with you.
In doing your work with therapy, did you figure out where that came from? What was the root cause of it?
Yeah, no, and I'm happy to talk about it because
Yeah.
I want to help destigmatize mental health.
Yeah.
I really wish more people knew that it was okay to not be okay. There's resources that are available, but step one is you've got to be ready to receive them. You have to be ready to
Yes.
sacrifice enough of your ego
Yep.
that you can let somebody else into your head enough to listen to.
Yeah.
And people all seem to realize therapy is not lying on the couch while Sigmund Freud asks about your mother and smokes a pipe over your shoulder.
Yeah.
It's about having conversations.
Yep.
And conversations that help you understand not only what you did and the impacts it might have had, but the why you did it. And that's where understanding where some of my little frustrations, the little snowball frustrations at the top of the hill, I let them roll until they were crushing houses
Yeah.
and dominating my thought process. It's common in any job that after a while people leave and there's turnover.
Yep.
And there was turnover at my job, and it led to me getting promoted. I now know that when you take a promotion or start a new job, you're not getting paid to do the job you used to do anymore. But that's where we often default to, because that's where our comfort is. As a fire instructor and someone that ran the recruit school, was responsible for the delivery of training programs, I was good at that. And I attached ego to being good at that.
Yep.
And then when I got promoted, I was less able to do those things, but I still wanted to control them.
Mm.
And when somebody else was hired to do the job I used to do, they didn't do it like I did.
Yeah, that's so hard to let go of. So difficult. Yeah.
And in that case, I saw it as wrong because there were things that over the course of 10 years that there's pieces of the program I created. And I had really good reasons for creating them, darn it.
Yeah.
And they took things in a different direction. I can now look back and see some of those things were beneficial to the program. Other things were not. But the key takeaway for me is it was okay for them to change. And that actually helped me look at the course of education I was going to take for my doctorate. And change and how and why we as humans are resistant to change and how we react to change are things that fascinated me. And that was the focus of my dissertation. I studied a change in public safety.
Okay.
And I looked specifically at a fire department that had someone die at a fire. And I wanted to understand how did the fire department change what they were doing as a result of that death. Now that's kind of not really a happy topic to look into, but it got worse because the first 4 fire departments that I went and interviewed that had lost a member weren't doing anything different. So they could have killed firefighter number 2 the same way they lost firefighter number 1 because they hadn't looked inward. They had only looked outward, had the ceremony. They adopted the rule of you never blame the dead fireman or the dead police officer or the dead EMT.
Yeah.
Yeah, and because we take the person who died and we elevate them in our minds, oh, they made the ultimate sacrifice. Well, there's a fire chief in Phoenix, Arizona that said, in our business, acts of extreme gallantry and extreme stupidity both get the same amount of honor at the funeral. And there was no conversation about what could have gone better because that painful conversation could have revealed that this person who died might have made a bad decision, or the person in charge of the fire might have made a bad decision.
And how do you do that without dishonoring their memory, right? That's the challenge there, right?
Then I found the 5th fire department. And their approach was, we are going to honor the memory by picking at all the scabs and letting them heal appropriately versus just letting them scar over and moving on. And that department, I spent the better part of a year, once or twice a week, going down to Southern Illinois, doing interviews, doing ride-alongs, attending their training sessions, talking to people, going to seminars about the experiences they've had, tracking what was their training like before the event versus 4 years after. I didn't talk to them about the event where the firefighter died, but what I did is I compared and interviewed them to understand give me a snapshot of the department in this year. Then the person died a year later, and I went in 4 years after that. So it was basically a comparison between 2 points in time, year 0 and year 4, where year 1 is where the fatality happened. I then started looking for different models that helped explain why some changes were successful and why some weren't. And that's led me to not only better able to apply change theory in my life, but it's helped me make that it's a hobby of mine, is to help people enact change and help them make a roadmap for change so it can be more successful, so that it can be less resistant. One of those areas I invested a lot of time was how to get firefighters to use a baby wipe to clean off their skin after every fire. And there's a couple different models I employ to help departments understand it's not as simple as you buy the baby wipes or you buy the most expensive baby wipes, and that's going to mean everybody's going to use them. That there has to be a lot more thought, planning, training, and education that goes into getting people to change behaviors. So one of the models I looked at to try and get firefighters to use baby wipes was the same one that was used to successfully get more physicians and healthcare providers in clinical settings to wash their hands.
In another episode, there was one of my guests had worked in the oil and gas industry, and he carried baby wipes with him, like when he just used the bathroom, because he liked being fresh. And he got called all of these like awful names because it was considered non-masculine to use a baby wipe. Is that the resistance that you were seeing with firefighters?
Yes, and there's a beautiful complexity to it. That same aspect of that same machismo of the fire service that makes it so that we are, our decisions shouldn't be questioned. We don't do anything wrong if we make the problem worse. And more importantly, that mental health is not something we need to worry about.
Yeah.
That stigma, that closed-mindedness makes us a little more change resistant. Additionally, when it's a profession that you plan on being in for your career, I've been involved in the fire service since 1992, but I've been exposed to enough changes, and I'm fascinated by how changes are successful or fail. So I'm not interested in a new firefighter coming on board a department today having to relive all of my mistakes. I'd love to give them shortcuts, but it's not common, or it is common in public safety recruit schools that instructors want the students to have the same experience they had when they came through recruit school. And if that was a negative experience, unfortunately, unless someone is educated and trained on how to teach and overcome their bad experiences, that might be what they want to project onto others. I had a conversation with someone who was very involved in a law enforcement training program last week. And we both talked about how we could identify those instructors in the recruit school that wanted to make sure that because their experience was miserable, they wanted everyone else to enjoy the same misery that they had. That if they were bullied as a new firefighter or new police officer, they wanted to bully others. And it's a toxic part of the culture. We can all verbally say that shouldn't happen, but to then be able to affect the change so it doesn't happen is very difficult.
We love to push our traumas down the line, don't we?
So back to your point about the baby wipes, fire service and law enforcement is a very change-resistant profession. As a result, even simple things are initially going to be mocked. I came into the fire service when air packs were the norm, but there was another highly advanced, very technical piece of fabric and metal that still isn't consistently used by every firefighter today. It's a seatbelt. But many firefighters and many police officers don't wear their seatbelts, and they'll mock people that do.
Is it just tradition? There's
a lot of justifications. Yeah. Initially, I can give people credit for, when I started, there was just a lap belt, and we couldn't get to that when we were in gear. Okay, what about now? One of the ride-alongs I did with a fire department just outside of Chicago, it was the first time I'd been in a fire engine that had a a butt sensor. So it knew if somebody which seats people were sitting in.
And whether they were wearing their seatbelt
whether
or not.
they had their seatbelt on. Now, I rode with that department several times. The first time, they pulled out going on a call, and the officer, because we're all wearing headsets, and I heard the officer say something to the driver, said, your seatbelt's not on. And the driver said, yeah, and kept driving. And we're going lights and sirens. It was for a smoke alarm. And the officer said, I'm going to need you to pull over after this intersection. And the driver said, well, sure, what's wrong? The officer said, you're not wearing your seatbelt. Driver retorted, so you're going to make me pull this expletive truck over because you think I need to wear my seatbelt? The officer, not wanting to get into a back and forth, just said, yes, now pull over. And they pulled over. The driver buckled up, and we quickly resumed. But that kind of willingness to be unliked it's very difficult in a profession where your health and safety may depend on that person you just pissed off.
Right.
And your health and safety may rely on someone you have had to discipline, someone that you have had to not promote. So it goes back to that integrity and trust. The third value that I hang my hat on is accountability. Call me out if I'm doing something wrong. I will call myself out if I do something wrong. I internalize it to the point where I might call myself out if you did something wrong, just so that it can appear that I'm owning your mistake, to show that it's not only okay to own your mistakes, but it's okay to acknowledge without blaming that somebody else made one.
Yeah.
The pastor at my church has a wonderful way of doing that. During his sermons, he'll be saying something that everybody in the audience in the gallery does, but he'll say, I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about me. Mm. When in reality, he's talking about
everybody.
The wipes are a change, and the wipes are contrary to the way we've always done things. And if there's not a strategy behind how do I teach an old dog new tricks, per se, it's going to be more difficult. Or if I'm the chief and I say skin decontamination is very important, and then 2 weeks later we run out of wipes, how important was it really? Or if the officers and the leaders, whether they're formal or informal, if they're not demonstrating the right behavior, if they're not using wipes but they're expecting their firefighters to. So there's all of those complexities of when you're trying to change something, that having a plan in advance can make the change more successful.
You mentioned you've used therapy as a tool for support for yourself. In my experience, there's sometimes a challenge with men and their communities and like the depth of their communities and the usefulness of their communities in their lives and in their emotional health and their mental health. Where do you find and create community?
I find that looking for coaches, mentors, and friends, and identifying which of those roles people are in. And there are people in my life that are in all three of those roles. It's very hard to conflate any two of them, and you really can't have all three at once. But I've had the first boss I had at the university, he articulated it to me very well. He said, look, we're going to be friends. You're going to come over to my house for dinner. We might go to a ball game together. We might have lunch or dinner together. But at the end of the day, it's my job to make sure you're doing your job.
Yeah.
So sometimes I'll give you advice that you can decide if you take it or not. Other times it's going to be a lot more directive that you need to do X, and there's not a lot of opportunity for debate. And that framing it that way, that we can have more than one dynamic to a relationship. And because something happens in one of those areas of our relationship doesn't mean everything is completely off, unless it's a breach of one of those core values. You operate without integrity in your personal life, I'm still going to acknowledge you at work, but that trust may be eroded. If I'm going to own that, I have to make sure you know that. Hey, I want to let you know when you did this, here's how I felt.
Yeah, you can't just keep that bottled up inside. Otherwise, they have no idea what the impact of their actions was, right?
It's the opposite of ascribing intent that we talked about earlier. The only thing worse than basically putting words in somebody else's brain for why they did something is harboring a grudge that they have no opportunity to acknowledge or repair.
So you have worked in multiple areas where I think it is still relatively male dominant. Nursing was probably the place where the opposite of that. What role have male friendships played in your life? Like this is one of the questions that I'm getting like really diverse answers to. So it really intrigues me. What role does that play in your life?
It's varied with where I am in my life. Sometimes I wanted someone that I could learn from, and I sought friendship from someone that could teach me. Yeah. Maybe that was within the workplace as a coach, or it was outside of my reporting line or chain of command as a mentor. There's people that I consider friends that I haven't interacted with in decades, but we were so close and they left such an impression on me at that point. As I've gotten older, I've started seeking more of those people out. And I have the advantage to travel a little bit for my day job at the university, but I also have a small LLC that I run that does educational programs about decision-making, culture change, and communication. And when I'm on those trips, or I also work for a group that does international accreditations around the world, I now look for who do I know that's where I'm going. I was in Colorado Springs 2 months ago, and I dropped on Facebook before I went, hey, any of my friends in the Colorado Springs area. And I got to meet up with someone that I went to nursing school with 25 years ago. We were very, very close in nursing school, but the last time we'd seen each other was in 1998 when we graduated. Now, we were friends on Facebook. The meeting we had, every so often we'd post the anniversary of our graduation, very, very superficial reinforcements of the connection we had.
Yeah.
But I got to meet her husband, her kids. We had dinner together, and it was picking up right where we left off 25 years earlier. Now that was a she, and you asked about male friendships, but I do the same thing. And I'm in a unique place with male friendships because most of my peer group growing up, I went to an all-boys Catholic school for high school. I was in Boy Scouts at a time when Boy Scouts, you had to be a boy. So that there was a lot of male groups that I was a part of. And many of those I still have regular interaction with today. There's some people where the friendship was very situational. They were in my life, I felt, for a reason.
Yeah.
There was one thing I needed to take away from them. There's others that were in my life for a season. They were somebody that I was really close with in college or high school, and I couldn't tell you what happened to them. Then there's other people that come in for a lifetime. It's interesting to me that some friendships take a lot of work and energy to get started, like a flywheel, but once you've got it going, it keeps itself moving.
Yeah.
I've got friends that were in my scout troop that we'll meet up whenever we're in the same place. It's like no time has passed.
My college roommates are like that. We try to get together on a semi-regular basis, and we have a text chain that's like a daily text chain that the four of us just have bonded, and it became stronger over the pandemic. There's something about everyone was getting on Zoom to talk to each other. They're like, you know what? We call each other every once in a while, but we never see each other's faces. Let's actually get on Zoom. And so now we do like a quarterly Zoom together. And it's that just, we're in Philadelphia and Seattle and Maryland and Illinois. And that's about the only way we can do it. But it's those kind of things. You're right. That description of like no time has passed and you're just like back into it with them is pretty awesome. So let's jump into our lightning round to wrap up this episode. I've got 11 questions that I'm going to throw at you pretty quickly. The first one you've sort of answered again, but we'll recap it for the audience. What are your top 3 values?
Integrity, trust, accountability.
Who is one role model you've had in your life?
I want to call out Colonel Richard Janey. Dick was a 30-year Marine, did some amazing work while he was in the service, left the Marines for a week, and came here as the fire training director for the state of Illinois. He's who hired me at the Fire Institute, gave me my first job at the university. He literally took me around the world and taught me how to be a more compassionate and engaged leader.
So who do you hope you are a role model for?
Number one is my boys, my daughter, my grandkids. That's that core nucleus. I hope that I'm a role model for my wife, but she will never admit that I have added any value to her life in the 30 years we've been together. There are people that I deliberately want to make sure I do good for, but I also want to make sure I'm leaving a positive impression on people that have never and will never meet me. I want people to come to the university to have a safe experience without knowing that that's something my team and I worked on. I want them to understand they can come and enjoy a football game and not have to worry about what's behind the curtain.
What's the one way you make the world a better place for others?
It's ironic that we're doing this tonight because the testimony I gave at church this morning was about how do I connect to God? And the way I've identified I connect to God is through public service and serving others. And as I look back on my career, that's the influence and the direction that God has pointed me in. And I've just screwed it up more often than not. I think I get it more right than wrong nowadays, but there was a lot more wrong than right starting out until I grew into the person that God wanted me to be and that I had the potential to become.
I think you need to give yourself the same grace that he's given you. What's the hardest thing about being you in today's world?
Not reacting emotionally. We are emotional beings. Even when we think we are being rational, we are being emotional.
Yeah.
And to prove that, think of any time that somebody made a comment to you, angered you, and 45 minutes later, you came up with the perfect comeback when they were long gone. That's because that's when the rational part of your brain kicked in. You were emotional the rest of that time.
Yeah.
And it is a daily struggle to make sure that I'm reacting objectively and rationally, and I am responding to a problem or crisis. I'm not just reacting because that lizard part of my brain that kept us alive this far in the evolutionary chain lit up because somebody told me no. And it sounds like a simple example, but the part of your brain that lights up and reacts when you're told no is the same part of your brain that triggers a full fight or flight response.
Yeah, because no means scarcity and scarcity means danger. Speaking of emotions, what's your favorite emotion?
Satisfaction plus 1%. I want to put it in the context of Psalms. It's satisfaction is your cup is full. Satisfaction plus 1% is when your cup runneth over. And when you have the opportunity to not only have the good for yourself, but you can pay it forward to other people.
Yeah, it's beautiful. I love that. I love that. So what's your least favorite emotion?
Anger. Didn't used to be until I understood all of those things that anger meant for me and where that anger came from and how often that anger was a result of my emotional non-intelligence or my lack of emotional maturity where I couldn't put a name to what was making me angry. Yeah. I just picked up that anger like a cloak, threw it on, and went forward.
Yeah.
Now I'll pick up that cloak, shake it out, fold it, hang it up, move on.
Yeah. It doesn't mean you don't get angry anymore. You just manage it better.
I don't give into it.
Yeah. So what brings you the most joy in life?
Seeing the people that I choose to surround myself with do well. Whether that's friends, family, it could be, it's funny. I have a job at the football games to make sure everybody's safe, but oftentimes that is being well taken care of and well in hand. And I just help people find their seats because I want everybody that comes to that stadium to have a good time. Yeah. Not the opposing team, but everybody else.
Yeah.
And just doing little things and trying to leave a positive impression, complimenting people. You know, I've complimented more people on their nails than I can count. Hey, your nails are really pretty. Yeah, maybe it's the only nice thing they've heard that day. Maybe it's the 50th time somebody has said that. But it is so easy to go to a place of negativity. And I would rather be a little bit of sunshine coming through the clouds than a bolt of lightning that hits the ground right next to you when you know the storm's coming.
Absolutely.
So just seeing the people that I love, the people I surround myself with, seeing them be successful, whether it's finding their seat, having a great day, finishing a degree, whatever that looks like, but adding that value to somebody else.
So what makes you the most proud of yourself?
Seeing how I've grown. I talked initially about that. I thought life was going to be from here to here. And no, it's this gigantic, messy ball that, it's still quivering sometimes in the middle. I couldn't anticipate where I am now from where I was. And sometimes it's even day to day with how I dealt with the challenge and taking a little bit of satisfaction that I met that challenge and went a little bit above it to make sure that I not only got through it, but I learned from it.
Throughout this entire episode, I get this feeling like that, and not just feeling, but it's obvious that your desire to serve others is this like just incredible driving force in your life. But I want to ask you a question about you, not other people. Where do you feel the most yourself?
When I'm alone. And I know that probably sounds counterintuitive. Yeah. I don't like crowds, and I'm very introverted. I'll need to sit down and just have a dog on my lap for the hour after we're done talking. And I needed a couple hours by myself after testifying at 3 church services this morning.
Yeah.
Because that being out like that and helping people, for as much as that brings me joy, it drains my battery in a heartbeat.
Yeah.
So I've learned to find the places inside of me and find the places that physically I can relax and be happy. Walking one of the dogs I have at home, that's relaxing. I enjoy, when I travel, getting out and experiencing the community where I'm at. I whether that's been taking a walk around the neighborhood where my hotel was in Saudi Arabia or Mumbai or Beijing or Chicago or Texas. It's getting a little bit of that local flavor, understanding what makes people tick, complimenting somebody on the funny t-shirt they're wearing there.
Yeah. Just
saying hi to somebody on the street that, not knowing what that does for their day. I enjoy finding time in nature too. And that's the fastest way for me to recharge is a walk in the woods. If I can find
me too. I'm with you there. I'll let you walk. I'll let you walk a few hundred yards ahead so you can have your space. But I will join you for that because it is the place where I feel like the most alive. One more question to wrap up the conversation today. What's the one thing that you hope people take away from this conversation?
Never stop learning. And I don't mean lifelong learner from the standpoint of, let me go take another class. My wife and I have an agreement that I'm not allowed to go back to school anymore. Spoiler, I still do. I just take shorter classes. I'm just not getting another degree.
Yeah.
But learning about yourself, asking yourself, why did I react that way? Why did I do that? That's where growth comes from. It's that space between where you are and where you want to be. And you're the only person that can fill in the distance between where you are and where you want to be. Absolutely. And it's not, you don't do it once. You do it every day when you wake up. There's a quote from one of the pastors whose podcast I really enjoy. And when he talks about self-improvement, he says, it's about your habits. And if you miss one day, that's okay. Yeah. But don't miss 2.
You miss 2 and it's a habit in the other way, in the other direction. So thank you so much, Brian. Really appreciated this. I learned a lot. I don't have a lot of experience in kind of the public safety first responder area. So some of this stuff I was kind of geeking out a little bit in your descriptions, but also just the wisdom that you brought to today's conversation about how like our lives are constant growth. And if we're not growing, we just kind of stagnate. And like we're meant to grow. We're meant to change, even though we have this kind of built-in resistance to it. So with that, I just want to wrap up today. And I'll wish you what I wish everybody that is on this podcast. And that is keep up the hard work. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you, Chris.
You can learn more about Illuminate at illuminate.substack.com. We are also streaming on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, and YouTube. Thanks for listening and watching, and we'll see you at the next episode of Illuminate.